There are mornings when death whispers your name before you're even fully awake. I should have listened to that warning when I opened my eyes on April 15th, 1995, feeling the strange weight of dread settle in my chest like a stone. The house felt too quiet, the sunlight streaming through our bedroom window seemed harsh and unforgiving, and somewhere deep in my bones, I knew this day would change everything. But how could I have imagined that in the span of 12 hours, I would lose not just my beloved husband to a senseless accident, but discover that my own son, the baby I had nursed and raised with my own hands, could transform into a monster capable of unthinkable cruelty. My name is Louise Miller, and today, at 73 years old, I'm finally ready to share the story that nearly destroyed me. The story of how I learned that the greatest betrayals don't come from strangers in dark alleys, but from the people who know exactly where to strike to cause the most damage. The story of how a mother's love can survive even when that love is met with hatred so pure and savage that it defies comprehension. I was born in 1952 in Millerville, Pennsylvania, a steel town where smokestacks reached toward heaven like prayers, and men's scarred hands told stories of honest labor. My father, Thomas Burke, built our house board by board with lumber from the mill where he worked, and my mother, Sarah, made it a home with her laughter, Sunday pot roast, and the kind of fierce maternal love that could heal scraped knees and broken hearts with equal skill. Those were different times when we believed tomorrow would always be brighter than today. When families stayed together through thick and thin, when a man's word was his bond, and a mother's love was sacred and unbreakable. We believed in loyalty, hard work, and the divine sanctity of the bond between parent and child. I met Frank Miller when I was 17 at a church social fundraiser for the volunteer fire department. He was 19 working at Henderson Steel Mill with calloused hands and the gentlest brown eyes I'd ever seen. He approached me while I was serving apple cider, his own hands trembling so badly he nearly dropped the cup I handed him. "Miss Louise?" he said, his voice soft and respectful. "I was wondering if you might. That is, if you wouldn't mind. Would you care to take a walk with me by Miller's Creek after the social?" His nervousness was endearing. Here was this strong young man who could handle molten steel and dangerous machinery reduced to stammering by a 17-year-old girl in a blue cotton dress. That walk by the creek lasted 2 hours, during which he told me about his dreams of saving enough money to buy a small farm, maybe raising some cattle, building a life that didn't depend on the whims of factory bosses. "And I want to give my future wife and children something better than what I had growing up," he said, skipping stones across the water. "Not that my folks didn't do their best, but a man should aim higher than just surviving, don't you think?" We courted for 2 years, always properly chaperoned, always with the blessing and supervision of our families. Frank would come to Sunday dinner at my parents' house, helping my father with repairs around the property, and discussing politics and baseball with the easy camaraderie of men who understood the value of honest work. He saved every penny during those 2 years walking the 3 miles to and from the mill to save bus fare, bringing his lunch in a paper bag instead of buying from the company cafeteria. We married in June 1971 in a ceremony so simple it was beautiful. My mother's 3-layer chocolate cake, his friend Jimmy's guitar providing the music, and promises we meant to keep forever. Our first apartment was 2 small rooms above Henderson's hardware store, with thin walls and windows that rattled when the wind blew, but Frank made it feel like a palace with his dreams and determination. "Louise, honey," he'd say, sitting at our tiny kitchen table after 12-hour shifts, sketching plans on the back of envelopes. "I'm going to build you a real house someday. White picket fence, big front porch garden where our babies can play." He'd work all day at the mill, then spend evenings taking correspondence courses to improve his reading and mathematics, determined to work his way up from the factory floor. I'd sit beside him, mending his work shirts and listening to him read aloud from his textbooks, both of us believing that education and hard work could overcome any obstacle. "You're going to wear yourself out," I'd tell him when he'd fall asleep over his books. A man who stops learning stops growing, Louise. I want to be worthy of you and whatever children God blesses us with. Mary arrived in 1972, a perfect baby girl, with her father's thoughtful eyes, and what would prove to be her mother's stubborn determination. From the moment she drew her first breath, she seemed to be reaching for something beyond our small world. Frank would hold her in his work-scarred hands, whispering promises and dreams. You're going to have choices, little darling. You're going to see the world beyond these factory walls. Your daddy's going to make sure of that. True to his word, Frank threw himself into work with renewed purpose. He took every overtime shift available, volunteered for the most dangerous assignments because they paid better, and slowly but steadily began climbing the hierarchy at Henderson Steel. I'd watch him leave before dawn, lunch pail in one hand, thermos of coffee in the other, walking with the determined gait of a man carrying his family's future on his shoulders. Daddy works too hard, Mary would say when she was old enough to notice that other fathers came home before dark. That's what good daddies do, sweetheart, I'd explain, brushing her dark hair before bed. They work hard so their little girls can have beautiful things and go to college someday. Will I really go to college, Mama? If your daddy has anything to say about it, you will. He's determined that you'll have opportunities he never had. When Mary was 8, we were blessed with another child, Junior, born in the spring of 1980. The pregnancy was difficult, keeping me bedridden for the final 4 months, while Frank juggled his demanding job caring for Mary and tending to my needs. He never complained, not once, though I could see the exhaustion etching deeper lines around his eyes each week. Junior was different from Mary from the very beginning. Where she had been a sunny, sociable baby who gurgled at strangers and reached for anyone who smiled at her, Junior was quiet and observant, seeming to study the world with serious, contemplative eyes. He preferred being held to being put down, and he had an uncanny ability to sense tensions or emotions that adults tried to hide. This one's got an old soul, my mother would say, rocking Junior while he stared up at her with those penetrating eyes. He's going to be deep, this boy. Probably artistic like my brother Eugene was. Frank tried to connect with Junior the same way he had with Mary, through gentle play, patient teaching, and bedtime stories about brave knights and noble quests. But where Mary had laughed and clapped her hands, Junior would simply watch and listen, absorbing everything but revealing little of his inner thoughts. He's just more sensitive, I'd tell Frank when he worried about Junior's quietness. Some children are naturally more introspective. There's nothing wrong with that, I suppose, Frank would reply, but I could see the concern in his eyes. I just want to understand him. You know, I want to be the kind of father he needs. As the years passed, Frank's dedication to providing for us never wavered, but the cost was becoming increasingly apparent. The steel industry was changing, becoming more mechanized, but also more dangerous. New machines that could do the work of 10 men, but required operators with nerves of steel and reflexes like lightning. Frank, now in his 30s, and a shift supervisor, was responsible not just for his own safety, but for the men working under him. He'd come home with stories that made my blood run cold, near misses, with molten metal equipment failures that could have killed someone's safety inspectors who were more concerned with production quotas than worker welfare. Frank, this job is going to be the death of you, I'd say, massaging the knots from his shoulders with liniment. This job is going to put Mary through college and give Junior a foundation to build on, he'd counter. A man doesn't get to choose his burdens, Louise. He just carries them as long as he's able. Mary excelled in school from the beginning, showing the same determination and focus that characterized her father. She devoured books, asked challenging questions, and set her sights on college from an early age. Frank would beam with pride at parent-teacher conferences where her instructors consistently praised her academic performance and leadership qualities. She's college material, no question about it, her high school guidance counselor told us during Mary's junior year. With her grades and test scores, she could qualify for scholarships at several state universities. Junior, on the other hand, struggled academically and socially. He was intelligent, his teachers confirmed that, but he seemed uninterested in applying himself to subjects that didn't capture his imagination. He'd spend hours drawing intricate sketches of buildings and landscapes, but couldn't be motivated to complete basic algebra assignments. "He's got talent," his art teacher, Mrs. Morrison, told me during a parent conference. "Real artistic ability, but he seems angry about something. There's a darkness in his work that concerns me." When I asked Junior about this, he simply shrugged and said, "Art is supposed to show truth, Mom. And the truth isn't always pretty." By the time Junior reached 13, his withdrawal from family life had become more pronounced. He'd started associating with older boys from the rougher part of town, teenagers who smoked cigarettes behind the school building and had already developed reputations for minor troublemaking. "I don't like those friends of yours," I told him one evening when he came home late, his clothes smelling of cigarette smoke and something else I couldn't identify. "They're not friends, Mom," he replied, his voice carrying a new edge of defiance. "They're just guys who understand how the world really works." "And how does the world really work, Junior?" He looked at me with eyes that seemed far too old for his 13-year-old face. "It works by strong people taking what they want from weak people. Everything else is just stories we tell ourselves to feel better." The cynicism in his voice alarmed me, but when I tried to discuss it with Frank, he was often too exhausted from work to engage in lengthy conversations about Junior's evolving worldview. "He's going through a phase," Frank would say, collapsing into his recliner after another 14-hour shift. "All boys his age think they know everything. He'll grow out of it." But as Junior moved through his 14th and 15th years, his phase seemed to deepen rather than resolve. He began staying out later, sometimes not coming home until well past midnight. His grades, never stellar, dropped to barely passing, and his attitude toward me in particular became increasingly hostile. "Why don't you get a real job instead of just sitting around the house all day?" he asked me one morning when I reminded him about a school assignment he'd forgotten. "I have a job, Junior. Taking care of this family is a full-time job." "Right," he sneered. "Making sandwiches and doing laundry? Really contributing to society there, Mom." Frank overheard this exchange and immediately intervened. "You will not speak to your mother that way, son. She works harder than anyone I know, and she deserves your respect." Junior's response was to storm out of the house, slamming the door so hard that the windows rattled. Frank started to follow him, but I stopped him. "Let him go. He's angry about something, and forcing a confrontation right now won't help. He's 15 years old, Louise. If we don't correct this behavior now, it's only going to get worse." Frank was right, of course, but I still held on to the hope that Junior's anger was temporary, that whatever was troubling him could be resolved through patience and understanding. I couldn't have imagined that the poison being poured into my son's ears was transforming him into someone capable of the kind of betrayal that destroys families and souls. The boys Junior had fallen in with were led by Tommy Brennan, a 19-year-old high school dropout with dead eyes and a philosophy that blamed women and minorities for every problem in society. Tommy had served time in juvenile detention for assault and had returned to our town with a head full of radical ideas about male superiority and the need to put females in their place. Women have forgotten their role. I overheard Tommy telling Junior and several other boys one afternoon when they were hanging around our front porch. "They think they can manipulate men with tears and sex and guilt, but real men see through that game." "My mom does that," Junior replied, and the casual way he betrayed our family's privacy made my heart sink. "Always crying about how hard her life is when my dad's the one killing himself at the factory." "Exactly," Tommy said. "Women are parasites. They take and take until there's nothing left. Then they play victim when the man finally breaks." I wanted to march out there and tell Tommy Brennan to stay away from my son, but Frank had asked me not to interfere directly. "The boy needs to figure out for himself that these aren't the kind of friends he should have," he said. "If we make it a battle, he'll just dig in deeper." So I watched helplessly as my sensitive, artistic son was gradually transformed into a young man filled with resentment and hatred. The change was subtle at first: sarcastic comments about female logic, eye-rolling, when I expressed opinions about politics or current events, increasing disrespect that Frank was too tired to address consistently. By early 1995, when Frank turned 45 and Junior was 15, the dynamics in our house had become strained and uncomfortable. Frank was working longer hours than ever, having been promoted to senior supervisor at a larger steel facility across town. The pay was significantly better, but the job was more dangerous and stressful. "I don't like this new position," I told him after his first week at the bigger plant. "You come home looking like you've been through a war. The money's too good to pass up, Louise. With Mary in college and Junior approaching graduation, we need every advantage we can get." "But at what cost? You're 45 years old, Frank. Your body can't take this kind of punishment indefinitely." He smiled tiredly and pulled me into his arms. "My body just needs to hold up for a few more years. Once the kids are established, I can look for something easier. Maybe that farm we used to dream about." "Do you still want the farm?" "More than ever. I want to wake up to roosters instead of factory whistles. I want to work with my hands in the dirt instead of with dangerous machinery. I want to grow old watching sunsets instead of watching safety gauges." We held each other in our small kitchen, both of us 30-something years old, but feeling much older, weighted down by responsibility and the grinding pressure of working-class life. If I had known that conversation was one of the last meaningful talks we'd ever have, I would have memorized every word. The morning of April 15th began like any other, but with that strange undercurrent of unease I mentioned earlier. Frank woke before his alarm, which was unusual, and stood at our bedroom window for a long moment, staring out at the pre-dawn darkness. "What is it?" I asked. "Nothing. Just, it's going to be a big day. Corporate executives are coming to inspect the new equipment. Could mean another promotion if everything goes smoothly." I got up and made his coffee while he showered and shaved, both of us moving through our morning routine with the practiced efficiency of long marriage. He ate his eggs and toast, quickly kissed me goodbye, and headed for the door. "Frank," I called after him. "Yeah." "Be careful today, okay? Something feels different." He came back and kissed me again, longer this time. "Always am, honey. Besides, I've got too much to live for to take stupid chances." Those were the last words my husband ever spoke to me. I spent the morning doing household tasks, laundry cleaning, preparing ingredients for dinner. Around noon, I walked to the grocery store to pick up a few items, chatting with neighbors and enjoying the unusually warm April weather. Everything seemed normal, ordinary, peaceful. At 2:15 in the afternoon, the phone rang. I was in the backyard hanging sheets on the line and humming an old hymn my mother used to sing. The phone's shrill ring cut through the peaceful afternoon like a knife through silk. "Mrs. Louise Miller?" "Yes." "This is Dr. Martinez from County General Hospital. I'm calling about your husband, Frank Miller." Time seemed to slow down. The wooden clothespin I'd been holding fell from my fingers and landed in the grass at my feet. Somewhere deep in my chest, a door slammed shut on the life I'd known. "There's been an industrial accident, ma'am. Your husband was brought to the emergency room, but I'm afraid his injuries were too severe. He didn't survive. I'm very sorry for your loss." The world tilted sideways. I remember the phone slipping from my hand, the coiled cord stretching as it fell toward the kitchen floor. I remember sitting down hard on the linoleum, my legs suddenly unable to hold me up. The rest is fragments, neighbors, appearing as if summoned by some invisible distress signal, someone driving me to the hospital. The terrible finality of seeing Frank's body on a cold metal gurney, still and somehow smaller than the man who'd kissed me goodbye that morning. A machine malfunction, they explained. A piece of equipment that should have been replaced years ago had finally given way during the corporate inspection, sending a chunk of metal into Frank's chest at deadly velocity. Death was almost instantaneous, they assured me, as if that detail could somehow soften the devastating blow of losing the man who'd been the center of my world for 24 years. The next few hours passed in a haze of paperwork, phone calls, and well-meaning people asking questions I couldn't process. Mary's college roommate drove her home through the night, a 6-hour journey that felt like a lifetime. When she walked into our living room, her eyes swollen from crying, We held each other and wept for the man who'd loved us both so completely. Junior was at school when the accident happened. I had to wait until 3:30 to tell him, sitting in our living room that suddenly felt too empty and too quiet. When he walked through the front door, I could see immediately that he sensed something was terribly wrong. "Mom, why are you sitting in the dark? Where's Dad?" I turned on the table lamp, its yellow glow doing nothing to chase away the coldness that had settled in my chest. "Son, come sit with me. I need to tell you something." He remained standing in the doorway, his backpack still slung over one shoulder, his young face already closing off in that defensive way he'd perfected. "It's Dad, isn't it? Something happened at the plant." "Junior, your father. There was an accident at work today. He was hurt very badly, and..." The words caught in my throat. How do you tell your 15-year-old son that his father will never come home again? How do you break that kind of news and somehow keep breathing yourself? "He's dead." It wasn't a question. Junior's voice was flat, emotionless, like he was commenting on the weather rather than acknowledging the death of his father. "Yes, son, I'm so very sorry." What happened next still haunts my nightmares. Instead of tears, instead of the normal grief response I expected from a boy who'd just lost his father, Junior's face hardened into an expression I'd never seen before. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and when he looked at me, his eyes held something cold and calculating. "How did it happen?" "A machine broke during an inspection. It was an accident, Junior. A terrible, senseless accident." "There are no accidents in factories, Mom. There are only owners who care more about profits than workers' lives, and workers too stupid to demand better." The bitterness in his voice shocked me. This was my 15-year-old son, not a labor organizer or political radical. "Junior, your father wasn't stupid. He was a good man who worked hard to provide for his family. He was a slave," Junior spat. "A slave who convinced himself he was doing noble work while the bosses got rich off his sweat and blood." Before I could respond, he turned and walked to his room, closing the door with deliberate control. I heard no crying, no sounds of grief or rage, just silence that felt heavier than screaming would have. The next 3 days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements and condolence visits. Mary stayed close to me, handling phone calls and organizing the logistics of death, while I moved through the motions like a sleepwalker. Friends and neighbors brought casseroles, shared memories of Frank, and offered the kind of comfort that comes from community during times of loss. Junior emerged from his room only when absolutely necessary, speaking in monosyllables, and maintaining that same hard expression that had appeared the moment I told him about his father's death. When people asked how he was holding up, he'd simply nod and say he was fine. But there was something in his manner that made visitors uncomfortable. "He's in shock," Mary explained to concerned relatives. "Everyone processes grief differently. But what I was seeing in my son wasn't shock or even normal teenage rebellion. It was something darker and more purposeful. It was anger looking for a target, and I was beginning to suspect that target might be me." The funeral was scheduled for Friday morning at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church, where Frank and I had been married 24 years earlier. The whole town seemed to turn out as co-workers from the steel mill, neighbors, from our street people, from church folks who'd known Frank as a decent man who worked hard and loved his family. Frank looked peaceful in the casket, wearing the navy blue suit he'd bought for Mary's high school graduation. His hands were folded over his chest, and if you didn't know better, you might think he was simply taking a nap after a particularly exhausting day at the plant. During the service, I watched Junior sit rigidly beside me, his jaw clenched so tightly, I worried he might crack his teeth. When Pastor Williams spoke about Frank's devotion to his family and his strong work ethic, Junior made a sound half-laugh, half-snort that caused several people to turn and stare. "Junior," I whispered urgently. "What's wrong?" He leaned close to my ear, and his words chilled me to the bone. "They're talking about him like he was some kind of hero, instead of a fool who worked himself to death for people who didn't give a damn about him." "Your father was a hero," I replied, keeping my voice low. "He sacrificed for us because he loved us.
He sacrificed because he was too weak to demand better, too weak to fight back against the bosses, too weak to see that his precious family was bleeding him dry.
The venom in his voice was so unexpected, so completely contrary to everything I thought I knew about my son, that I felt physically sick. Mary reached across me and grabbed Junior's arm.
"Stop it," she hissed. "Show some respect for Dad and for everyone who came here to honor him."
Junior shrugged her off and went back to staring straight ahead, but I could feel the anger radiating from him like heat from a furnace. For the rest of the service, I sat between my grieving daughter and my mysteriously hostile son, wondering what had happened to transform my quiet, artistic boy into this bitter stranger. After the burial at Hillcrest Cemetery, people gathered at our house for the traditional meal. The living room and kitchen filled with quiet conversation shared memories of Frank and the kind of subdued fellowship that follows loss. I moved among the guests like a ghost, accepting hugs and condolences, while my mind kept returning to Junior's disturbing behavior at the church. Around mid-afternoon, the crowd began to thin as people returned to their normal lives. Mary was in the kitchen with several of the church ladies cleaning dishes and wrapping leftover food in aluminum foil. The house felt too crowded, too full of voices offering sympathy that couldn't touch the hollowness inside my chest. I needed a few minutes alone, a chance to breathe, without having to perform grief for an audience of well-meaning neighbors and relatives. I slipped away to the bathroom at the end of the hallway, the same small space where Frank had shaved that final morning, where his Old Spice aftershave still lingered faintly in the air. I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bathtub, finally allowing myself the luxury of falling apart in private. The tears came in waves for the future Frank and I would never share, for the grandchildren he'd never meet, for the simple daily routines that would now be performed alone. I don't know how long I sat there crying for everything I'd lost. When I finally felt composed enough to return to the remaining guests, I stood up and reached for the door handle. That's when I heard voices in the hallway outside, male voices, young, speaking in tones that made every instinct in my body scream danger.
"She's been in there forever. Perfect. Everyone else is busy cleaning up."
"You sure about this, man? Today of all days."
"Today's perfect. She's vulnerable and no one's paying attention."
I recognized one of the voices as Tommy Brennan, the 19-year-old who'd been filling Junior's head with poison for months. The others were unfamiliar, but they all carried the same edge of barely controlled violence that had been creeping into my son's demeanor. My hand froze on the doorknob. My heart began hammering against my ribs so hard, I was sure they could hear it through the door. "Junior," I called out, hoping desperately that my son was nearby, hoping he would tell these boys to leave our house and let us grieve in peace. "Yeah, Mom, I'm right here." Relief flooded through me. Whatever these boys were planning, surely Junior would put a stop to it. Surely my son, despite his recent anger and confusion, wouldn't allow harm to come to his mother on the day we'd buried his father. I unlocked the door and started to open it, but it was suddenly pushed inward with such force that I stumbled backward into the sink. 4 young men crowded into the small bathroom, and behind them came Junior. But the face looking at me wasn't my son's. This was a stranger wearing my child's features, his eyes holding a hatred so pure and focused that it stole my breath.
What's going on?"
I managed to ask, though every maternal instinct was screaming that I was in mortal danger. "Time for a reality check." "Mom," Junior said, his voice eerily calm. "Time for you to understand what you really are and what you've done." Tommy Brennan, a young man with dead eyes and scars on his knuckles from fights he'd obviously won, smiled at me like a predator that had successfully cornered its prey. "Junior's been telling us all about you, Mrs. Miller," Tommy said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "About how you nagged his dad to death. About how you never appreciated the sacrifices he made for this family. About how you're just another parasite who sucks the life out of good men." "That's not true," I whispered, pressing back against the sink until I could retreat no further. I loved your father. We both did. Everything he did, we did together. Love. Junior laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You call it love when you guilt a man into working himself to death. You call it love when you spend his blood money while he destroys his body in that factory. I stared at my son, this boy I'd carried in my womb, nursed at my breast, comforted through nightmares and fever, trying to understand how he could have transformed so completely. The Junior, where is this coming from? Your father worked hard because he wanted to provide for us. He was proud of what he did. He loved his family. He was a slave. Junior shot back, his voice rising. A slave who convinced himself he was being noble, while you and Mary lived off his sacrifice like parasites. Just like all women do. One of Tommy's companions, a thin boy with acne scars and hate-filled eyes, stepped closer to me. Time for you to pay the price, lady. Time for you to understand what happens to women who destroy good men. That's when I finally understood. This wasn't just about teenage rebellion or misplaced grief. These boys had been feeding Junior a toxic philosophy that painted women as enemies, as parasites who needed to be punished for the crime of existing. And I was about to become the target of all that accumulated hatred and resentment. Please, I said, my voice barely audible. Junior, these boys don't know our family. They don't understand what your father and I built together. Don't let them— The first blow cut off my words. Junior's open hand across my face with enough force to snap my head to the side and split my lip. The shock was greater than the pain my own son, the child I would have died to protect, had just struck me. Shut up, he said, his voice still unnaturally calm. Just shut your mouth and take what's coming to you. What followed was a nightmare that lasted perhaps 10 minutes, but felt like hours. 4 sets of hands holding me down while my son, my baby, the child I'd sung to sleep and comforted through childhood fears, systematically destroyed every boundary that should exist between mother and child. The physical pain was excruciating, but the psychological devastation was complete. Every slap, every cruel word, every violation was designed not just to hurt my body, but to obliterate my sense of self, my understanding of what family meant, my ability to trust in the basic goodness of the human heart. This is for my dad, Junior whispered in my ear while his friends restrained me. This is what you deserve for killing the only decent man you ever knew. Tommy Brennan held my arms while the others took turns following Junior's lead. No point making noise, Mrs. Miller, he said with mock sympathy. Everyone's in the kitchen eating your dead husband's funeral food. They can't hear you back here, and they wouldn't care if they could. Through it all, I kept searching my son's face for some trace of the boy I'd raised, some flicker of conscience or remorse or basic human decency. But there was nothing there except cold satisfaction, as if he was finally getting revenge for some imagined injustice I'd committed against him. The other boys seemed to be following his lead, taking their cues from his behavior. If he could betray and assault his own mother, then she must deserve whatever happened to her. The logic of mob mentality where individual conscience is surrendered to group dynamics. You know what the worst part is? Mom, Junior said when they were finished with me and I was crumpled on the cold bathroom floor like discarded garbage. Dad died still thinking you were worth something. He never figured out that you're just another bloodsucker who takes and takes until there's nothing left. He paused at the door, looking down at me with what might have been disappointment rather than satisfaction. Maybe now you'll understand your place in the world. Maybe now you'll stop pretending you're some kind of victim. Then they were gone, leaving me alone with my pain and the sound of normal conversation drifting down the hallway from the kitchen. People sharing memories of Frank and eating casseroles, while his widow lay destroyed in the back bathroom. I don't know how long I remained on that cold tile floor. Time had no meaning in that small enclosed hell where my son had just murdered the woman I used to be? Eventually, I managed to pull myself up to clean the blood from my face and straighten my torn clothes enough to make myself presentable. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a broken stranger staring back at me. My lip was split and swollen. My left eye was beginning to blacken, and there were finger-shaped bruises on my throat where someone had tried to silence my screams. But the worst damage was invisible, the complete destruction of my faith in family, in love, in the possibility that the people we raise and nurture could ever truly belong to us. I managed to unlock the door and step into the hallway, moving like an old woman, despite being only 43 years old. Mary was still in the kitchen laughing at some story one of the church ladies was telling. The sound of her laughter, so normal, so innocent, nearly brought me to my knees. Mom. She looked up as I appeared in the doorway. There you are. Mrs. Patterson was just telling us about the time Dad helped fix her roof after that storm. Are you feeling okay? You look pale. Just tired, I managed to say. It's been a long day. She studied my face with the concern only a daughter can show. You should sit down. Let me get you some tea. I think I'll just rest for a bit. I retreated to my bedroom and closed the door, sitting on the edge of the bed Frank and I had shared for so many years. His pillow still held the faint scent of his shampoo and the Old Spice he'd worn every day since I'd known him. I held it against my chest and tried to comprehend what had just happened to me. My son, the baby I'd carried and loved and protected, had just committed an act so monstrous that there was no coming back from it. No forgiveness possible. No way to rebuild the trust that had been shattered, along with my body and spirit. The guests left gradually as the evening wore on. Mary came to check on me several times, but I pretended to be sleeping. Junior never appeared, and I was grateful for that small mercy. I wasn't sure what I would do if I had to look at his face again so soon after what he'd done. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of our house settling for the night. Around midnight, I heard the front door open and close, then Junior's footsteps in the hallway. He paused outside my bedroom door for a moment, and I held my breath, terrified he might enter. But he continued to his own room, and I heard his door close with deliberate softness. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen eating cereal and reading the newspaper, like any normal teenager preparing for school. When he saw me enter, my face still bearing the evidence of what he'd done, he actually smiled. "All morning, Mom," he said with casual cheerfulness. "Sleep well." The sheer audacity of it, the complete absence of shame or remorse, nearly brought me to my knees. This was my punishment then, not just the physical assault, but having to live with the person who'd committed it, pretending everything was normal while my world had been turned inside out. "I'm making coffee," I said, my voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. "Thanks. I've got a test today, so I need to be alert." He spoke as if we were having a perfectly ordinary mother-son conversation, as if he hadn't brutally assaulted me less than 12 hours earlier. The casual cruelty of it was almost more devastating than the original attack. I lasted 3 days. 3 days of jumping every time he entered a room, of lying awake, terrified he might come for me again, of watching him interact with neighbors and teachers and Mary as if he were still the sweet, troubled boy he'd once been, while I knew the monster he'd revealed himself to be. On the 4th day, while Junior was at school, I packed a single suitcase with essential clothes, important documents, and the few pieces of jewelry Frank had given me over the years. I looked around the house where I'd been happy, where I'd raised my children and loved my husband, where I'd believed in the security of family bonds. Every corner held memories, some beautiful, others, now forever tainted by what had happened in that bathroom. I sat at the kitchen table where Frank had sketched his dreams and wrote a brief note to Junior, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold the pen. "Junior." I wrote, tears blurring my vision. "I can't live in the same house with you anymore. What you did was unforgivable. I'm leaving, and I don't want you to try to find me. The house is yours now.
Do with it what you will.
I don't know what I did to make you hate me so much, but clearly, you can no longer stand to have me as your mother. So I'm setting you free from that burden.
Goodbye. Louise. I sealed the letter in an envelope, left it on the kitchen table where he would find it, and walked out the door of the only home I'd known as an adult. I didn't look back.
The bus ride to Mary's college town was the longest journey of my life each mile, taking me further from everything familiar, from the life I'd built with such care and hope. I stared out the window at farmland and small towns, wondering if I would ever feel safe anywhere again, if I would ever be able to trust my own judgment about the people I loved. Mary met me at the bus station, her face creased with worry. She'd been expecting me to visit eventually, but not so soon after the funeral, and not with a suitcase and the hollow look of someone who'd lost more than a husband. Mom, what happened? You look terrible. Where's Junior? Junior has chosen a different path, I said carefully. I can't live with him anymore. That evening, in Mary's tiny apartment, I told her a carefully edited version of the truth. Junior had become involved with a dangerous crowd. There had been an incident. I couldn't stay in the same house with him. What kind of incident? Mary pressed her voice tight with concern. He's not the boy we raised anymore, honey. The grief and those friends have turned him into someone I don't recognize. Someone dangerous. Mary wanted to call the police to drive back home and confront Junior to somehow fix whatever had been broken. But how do you fix a son who's become a predator? How do you repair a family after betrayal that cuts to the very core of what family means? Some things can't be mended, sweetheart, I told her. Some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. I stayed with Mary for 2 months, sleeping on her couch and trying to rebuild some sense of normalcy from the wreckage of my former life. We never spoke directly about what had really happened in that bathroom, but I think she suspected the truth was worse than what I'd told her. Sometimes I'd catch her looking at me with a sadness that went deeper than sympathy for a grieving widow. Eventually, I found my own small apartment and got a job waiting tables at a local diner. The work was simple and honest, and it kept my hands busy while my heart tried to heal from wounds that went deeper than bone. I saw a counselor recommended by the crisis center, a kind woman who helped me understand that survival was possible even after the kind of betrayal I'd experienced. Mary graduated that spring with the honors Frank had always known she'd achieve. I sat in the audience proud and heartbroken in equal measure, knowing he should have been there to see his daughter receive her diploma. After the ceremony, Mary hugged me tightly. I wish Dad could have seen this.
He did see it, honey. Wherever good fathers go when their work on earth is finished, he was watching and beaming with pride.
Mary got a good job in Chicago and eventually married a decent man who reminded me of Frank in his quiet strength and unwavering devotion. They gave me 3 beautiful grandchildren who helped fill some of the emptiness in my chest. I learned to smile again, to find joy in their laughter, and antics to believe in the possibility of goodness, even after experiencing the depths of human cruelty. But I never completely healed from what Junior had done. How could I? Some wounds leave scars that ache with every change in weather, reminders of damage that goes too deep to ever fully repair. Years passed. I built a quiet life, found peace in routine, discovered that it was possible to be content, if not completely happy. I volunteer at the crisis center, now helping other women who've survived violence from the people they trusted most. My story, while unique in its specific details, is part of a larger pattern of human capacity for both evil and resilience. In 2010, 15 years after Frank's death and that terrible day that destroyed my family, a chaplain from the state prison called to inform me that Junior had died of a heart attack while serving a sentence for armed robbery and assault. He was 30 years old.
He left something for you, the chaplain said. A letter he wrote several months before he passed. Would you like me to mail it to you?
I almost said no. What could Junior possibly have to say to me after all these years? But curiosity won over caution, and a week later, I held his final words in my trembling hands. Mom, I know I don't have the right to call you that anymore. I know I gave up that privilege the day I became someone you couldn't recognize, someone who hurt you in ways that can never be taken back or forgiven. I've had a lot of time to think in here. About Dad, about what happened to our family, about the poison those guys filled my head with when I was too young and angry to see it for what it was. Tommy Brennan and his crew convinced me that women were the enemy, that you were somehow responsible for Dad's death, that putting you in your place would somehow honor his memory. I know now how wrong I was. I know now that Dad died because he was a good man, working in a dangerous job for people who cared more about profits than safety. I know now that you loved him completely and that he loved you the same way. I know now that what I did to you that day was unforgivable. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and I know you could never give it, even if I did. I'm just asking that you know I understand now what I threw away when I chose hatred over love, when I let other people's poison turn me against the woman who gave me life. I hope you found some peace after I destroyed our family. I hope Mary and her children brought you joy. I hope you know that somewhere in this prison, in whatever's left of the boy you raised, there was always a part of me that remembered being loved by you. I'm sorry, Mom, for everything.
Junior, I read that letter 3 times before the tears made it impossible to continue. Then I sat at my small kitchen table and wrote my own response, not to mail because Junior was already gone, but because I needed to put my feelings into words one final time.
Junior.
You were right about one thing. What you did was unforgivable. Not because I'm unwilling to forgive, but because it killed something in me that can never be resurrected. The mother who could see good in everyone, who believed love was enough to overcome any obstacle, who trusted that her children would never become her enemies. That woman died in the bathroom on your father's funeral day. What survived was someone harder, more careful, less willing to believe in the basic goodness of people. Maybe that's not entirely a bad thing, but it's a loss I've mourned every day since. I can't forgive you, but I can understand that the boy who used to draw me pictures of houses and bring me dandelions from the yard got lost somewhere in his grief and confusion. I can grieve for that boy while still holding the man accountable for his choices. You were wrong about your father, though. He didn't die because he was weak or foolish. He died because he was strong enough to sacrifice his own comfort for our future, because he believed in something bigger than himself. That's not weakness, that's the most powerful thing a human being can do. I won't pretend your letter healed everything. Some damage runs too deep for that. But it helps to know that somewhere in that prison, you remembered being loved. It helps to know you finally understood what you destroyed.
Rest in peace, son. Maybe in whatever comes after this life, you can find your way back to the boy you used to be. Your mother, Louise. I never mailed that letter. Instead, I took both letters to Hillcrest Cemetery, to Frank's grave, where I still bring flowers every month. I sat beside his headstone and read both letters aloud, letting the wind carry the words to wherever he might be listening. Then I tore both letters into small pieces and scattered them among the daffodils Mary had planted around his grave. Some stories need to end with words. Others require the mercy of silence and letting go. Now, at 73, I live quietly in a house not far from Mary and her family. I volunteer at the crisis center, helping women who've experienced violence from people they trusted. I've learned that my story, while devastating in its personal details, is part of a larger human pattern of survival and healing. I've also learned that recovery isn't just about enduring the terrible thing that happens to you. It's about finding ways to transform that experience into something that serves a purpose beyond your own pain. My suffering became a bridge to other women's healing. My brokenness taught me how to help others mend. The nightmares still come, sometimes usually triggered by unexpected sounds or sudden movements that remind me of that day. I still check locks twice and keep a phone by my bed. I probably always will. But I also have moments of pure joy watching my grandchildren play in their backyard, feeling Mary's arms around me in a hug that promises safety, catching the scent of honeysuckle on a summer evening, and remembering that beauty still exists alongside horror. People often ask me how I survived such a profound betrayal without letting it destroy my faith in everything good. The answer is both simple and complex. I had a choice between becoming someone defined by what was done to me or someone shaped by how I chose to respond to it. I chose healing over bitterness. I chose purpose over self-pity. I chose to believe that one person's capacity for evil doesn't negate another person's capacity for good. Most importantly, I chose to reclaim my right to define my own life rather than letting one terrible event control my future forever. Frank used to say that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was doing what needed to be done despite being afraid. I was terrified for years after Junior's assault. Terrified of trusting anyone, terrified of being vulnerable, terrified that the next person I loved might also transform into an enemy. But I chose to love anyway. Carefully, selectively, but genuinely. I chose to trust Mary when she promised to keep me safe. I chose to trust the counselors who helped me process my trauma. I chose to trust the other women at the crisis center who understood what it meant to survive betrayal by family members. And gradually, choice by choice, day by day, I rebuilt a life that had meaning and purpose, and even moments of genuine happiness. Junior and his friends thought they were teaching me a lesson about my place in the world, about the worthlessness of women, about the consequences of loving someone who worked himself to death. But the only lesson I learned was that some people's darkness is so complete, it can transform love into hatred, children into predators, families into battlegrounds. I also learned that surviving such darkness requires more strength than most people realize they possess. It requires the willingness to start over, to build new relationships, to trust again, despite having every reason not to. It requires the courage to refuse to let someone else's evil define your worth or determine your future. My story isn't just about survival, it's about reclamation. I reclaimed my right to peace, to dignity, to relationships built on mutual respect and genuine care. I reclaimed my identity as someone worthy of love and protection. Most importantly, I reclaimed my power to write my own ending, rather than letting Junior's violence be the final word in my story. The sun still rises every morning, even after the darkest nights. Love still exists, even after the deepest betrayals. Hope still flowers, even in the most barren emotional soil. Take my word for it, I'm 73 years old. I've seen the worst of what people can do to each other, and I'm still here, still grateful, still believing that tomorrow can be better than yesterday, no matter what happened in between. That's not just survival, friends. That's triumph over everything that tried to destroy me. And if an ordinary woman from a small steel town can find her way back to the light after such profound darkness, then anyone can. The human heart is more resilient than we imagine. The human spirit is stronger than the forces that seek to crush it. And the human capacity for rebuilding, for healing, for choosing love over hatred and hope over despair. That capacity is limitless if we're brave enough to use it. This is my story, but it doesn't have to be anyone else's ending. If you're reading this and you've experienced betrayal or violence from someone you loved, please know that your story can have a different conclusion. Yes, you'll carry scars. Yes, some trust once broken may never be fully restored. But within the ruins of what was lost, you can build something new and beautiful and entirely your own. I'm living proof that it's possible.